I built this multi-unit shelf for my daughter's room without using dimensional lumber. I created thick shelves, which I really like the bulky look, added some edge banding veneer, and made a few mistakes along the way. I have plans in the description that you can download to build one yourself. Follow me along as I stumble my way through it. And I think it turned out pretty good. So here we go. Another Dude Sawdust project that the people didn't ask for, but I just know deep down in my heart they wanted. Despite my best efforts at reducing any maple veneer plywood chip outs by changing out my table saw and miter saw blades with 60 and 100 tooth fine finish blades, most of the cuts came out pretty good, but a few did not. It wasn't the blade's fault, it was probably mine. This entire project can be cut from just one 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch and 1/4 inch plywood. You can choose the veneer you like. I chose maple. This multi-level shelf is pretty straightforward. The first thing I did was cut all of my plywood down to size, and since I had plans to follow that I designed on SketchUp, it was even easier. I also made a cut list that will be provided in the build plans that you can find in the video description. One mistake that I made when cutting all of this plywood was failing to use a zero clearance sacrificial fence on my miter saw and a zero clearance throat plate on my table saw. So some of the cuts had chip out. Note to self, next time be prepared and go zero clearance on everything. And because I haven't built myself an ideal miter saw station yet, I ran into this problem. When going back and forth with large sheets of plywood from the table saw to the miter saw leaves room for error, whether it be a 64th or a 32nd of an inch. These pieces right here are the shelves, and they need to be the exact same width. These are the backing parts of the shelf, and they need to be the exact same width, but they're slightly off. That's not a problem. It's important to know that these pieces don't have to be any particular width, they just have to be the same, as well as these. So I'm going to take these pieces through the table saw with the fence locked in place, and just take off enough so that they're exactly the same. And I'm going to do the same with these the desired width. As I was in the middle of cutting these pieces again, it had dawned on me that it probably would have been easier to just glue up the layers of plywood first and then trim them to size. That's just a tip for those of you considering using these plans to build the same shelf. These are now the exact same size, so next step is a glue up. But before I start gluing, I need to organize my plywood layers into groups that would make up each shelf platform and shelf backing. Also, let me take this moment to explain something. If you clicked on the thumbnail to this video wondering what is inside of these shelves, then let me explain. You see, achieving the ideal thickness of shelves for any given project is what creates the aesthetic look you're striving to achieve. The thickness of one sheet of plywood looks very basic and typical of what you might find in a standard closet. The thickness of two sheets of plywood just looks like you're trying too hard and it really looks awkward. But I figured out that if you take 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood and then add a single layer of 1/4 inch plywood, it's the sweet spot of perfectly sized shelves.
I can't find one flaw.
I took this layer approach because it really seemed easier than making boxes. Ultimately, I'm not sure what is easier because both methods have their own set of challenges, but it was a great exercise that posed new problem-solving opportunities, and I was very pleased with the final outcome. I glued the panels together using Titebond wood glue and spring clamps, and getting these panels glued perfectly together posed a new set of challenges. One of the problems I'm running into when doing these glue ups is that the panels are slipping around. I want to get these lined up as best as I can, as flush as possible, but when I clamp them, they start to move. So I'm going to use a little trick and apply some salt. The salt, I don't need a lot, just enough to provide grit, and then it won't slide. That's a lot better. This is a great gluing tip, but stay tuned to find out how this ended up backfiring on me. I call that a blatant attempt at foreshadowing. Despite that great gluing tip that is widely known amongst woodworkers, For this particular project, I think the best way to glue panels together is using a combination of first placing the weight on top and then using spring clamps for the edges. And so on and on with the gluing process, one panel after another. Once that was complete, I was ready for the next step by preparing the back panel. In order for this shelf to fit flush against the wall without having to drill through the piece into the stud of the wall for it to hang, I'm gonna create a little recessed hole where we can put a cleat, and I gotta measure that out. This square gives us a big enough hole where we could put a big bulky cleat on the wall and a big enough cleat here to give it plenty of support to hang on that wall. Let's cut this out. In most instances, you'll see woodworkers drill a hole to drop the jigsaw blade into to start a cut. But I honestly thought it would be more fun to practice some plunge cutting with my jigsaw. Plunge cuts can be intimidating, but if you have a decent jigsaw like mine, then they are a breeze and pretty accurate way to make a straight cut freehand. And by the way, if you are interested in my DeWalt barrel grip jigsaw or any other tool or product used in this video, then click on the video description for affiliate links so you can purchase them. The commissions help support Dude Sawdust at no extra cost to you. I designed this shelf unit as a fairly simple puzzle. I just had to create the puzzle pieces and then put them all together. It is here that I'm seeing how well everything goes together, and I'm trying to find any flaws that I need to correct before assembling them. I have everything in place except for this cover sheet here and this cover piece here that I'm gonna trim to size later. But in order to edge band effectively, all of these seams need to be as flush as possible, and they all glued up really well. Except there are some slight variations, like a little bit of a lip here, a little bit of a lip right there, as well as here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to shrink this entire thing down by a couple of millimeters on all the edges. So we'll trim down these sides, as well as these sides, as well as this big piece right here. It won't have any impact on its function, but in the end, everything will be so much more perfect now that we have it glued up. With all of the puzzle pieces trimmed again, I assembled them again to make sure everything looked good, or at least good enough for the next step. I have these pieces right here that go on top, and what this does is it hides this seam. So that was my idea. You don't have to do this, but it's something that I wanted to do, make it look kind of like all one simultaneous piece without that seam. I'm gonna glue this together. I probably should have glued this on before I did all that trimming off, because I'm gonna have to trim this off anyways. Let's see how this goes. With that panel glued on and flush trimmed to size, it was time to do the assembly and glue up. I used my positioning squares and a variety of clamps to get everything just right. This was a fairly tedious process since I had to wait for the glue to dry enough to be able to apply the next piece. One thing I noticed was I must have measured incorrectly because this window in the plywood should have fallen between two shelf blanks, and it clearly did not. Good thing I'm used to making mistakes, otherwise this would have been hard to deal with. Emotionally, that is. Wood glue is super strong, and this shelf will still have plenty of stability on all 3 points of contact, and this won't be bearing lots of weight, so I'm not really too worried about it. I intentionally made the back panel longer than expected because once I put everything together, I didn't want to find out that it was even a millimeter too short. I knew when it came time I could just trim off any extra with my saw and flush trim bit. By the way, I have come to the realization that my favorite tool to use in the shop is a flush trim bit. There just isn't anything more satisfying. I think it's because it truly turns something awful into something awesome with one single swoop. It doesn't kind of do it sometimes, it does it purely and simply 100% of the time. I built a king-size bed many years ago that used these massive pipe clamps for that project. I don't think I've used them since then, and they came in real handy for clamping on this final panel that covers the seam. Using just spring clamps on only 3 sides would have potentially created less than satisfying results. Speaking of satisfying, check me out. I want to show you some of the troubles I had with this project. The whole kind of idea was to be able to make this thing with only pieces of plywood and glue and not use any fasteners. In the process, I came across a couple different things. Along this seam, this piece was not cut exactly perfect, or there was something went wrong. Now I used salt to glue these two together to create friction. In that process, it did create a micro gap between the pieces, and that micro gap is not exactly symmetrical. So what that caused is this to be slightly wider here than it was over here, or vice versa. So this piece, when put in, creates a bit of a gap, and then it just didn't line up exactly perfect. It has good adhesion on 3 of these sides with the glue, but it did create a gap here, so I used wood filler just to glue it, and aesthetically I think it looks just fine. The problem is if you lift up in the center, it creates this little less than 1 millimeter crack. I don't think it's a big deal. As it hangs on the wall, it'll look just fine, but nonetheless, that's what exists. Now when I put the edge banding on, I don't think that's going to make an impact at all. And of course, time will tell. So we shall see. But cutting these pieces exactly perfect is actually kind of difficult. It just takes a hair for it to be off just by a little. To prep for finishing an edge banding, I lightly sanded with 220 grit on all the plywood veneers to get rid of any marks made by the spring clamps and just general smoothness. I also used a more aggressive grit to sand all the seams so the edge banding wouldn't have any abrupt transitions between any of the plywood pieces. The actual thickness of these 3 pieces of plywood is 1 inch and 17/32 when they're all stacked on top of each other. So I used 2-inch maple edge banding for the entire shelf unit. I have to admit, I really enjoy edge banding and all of the different techniques you can use to get the same or similar results. There are quite a variety of tools that can be used, and they vary from expensive to actually quite dirt cheap. I'm not going to go into depth in this video about how I did the edge banding. Since I was doing plenty of it for this project, I decided to create an edge banding video series that will be released in the near future. I'm currently working on them, and it's my plan to make them a bit more interesting and uniquely informative than all the other edge banding videos out there. So be on the lookout for those and support the channel by watching them. In case you were wondering, because we all know you weren't, I'm a French cleat fanboy who will look for any reason to hang something with a cleat. This shelf is no exception. A French cleat is simply a 45-degree cut piece of wood that hangs on another 45. They are very stable, hold more weight than you would imagine, and allow your hung piece to be easily taken on and off. With this recessed cleat, the shelf will be able to hang on the wall without being able to even see how it's actually hung. And I used my favorite water-based polyurethane as a protective coat against any wear and tear, and that is General Finish's High Performance Satin Top Coat. I applied 3 coats with a 3-inch foam brush and sanded between coats. I could not have been more pleased with the outcome. We've been slowly customizing and designing our daughter's room while allowing her the final say on design. This shelf is something she picked out online, and I made my version of it. In some of my earlier videos, Taya would help me by actually being in them, but as she has aged, it has become much more difficult, getting a very self-aware teenager to pose for the camera, especially without full hair and makeup. But as her father, I fully anticipated this phase of her life, so typically I would showcase her showing off her new shelf that Dad built, but we will all have to go without. You would think kids these days would jump at the chance to be in the video of an incredibly famous YouTuber, but apparently I'm just not that famous enough yet. Or maybe it's because I'm just dad. But I'm sure the day will come when Mr. Beast and I are competing for who has the most subscribers. Maybe then she'll regret not being in this video, just like you will regret not watching this video right here, where I bring you on an edge-bending video series journey like no other, where I show you everything you need to know and some things you've never even seen about edge bending. So click and watch it right now, and if it's not there yet, I'll leave a different video you'll love too.